I'm James, and this is Producing Fun, a podcast about making games from a product perspective. Welcome to Producing Fun. My guest this week is Nick Bentley, president of Game Studio at Underdog Games, formerly of North Star Games, and a neuroscientist. I've been trying to get Nick on the show for absolutely ages. Nick is not only one of my favourite follows on Twitter, spitting out interesting ideas about game design, product, and life in general at a furious rate. He's also a key part of a business I find fascinating. Underdog Games was only founded 4 years ago and has but a small product range to its name. But in that time, it has sold 450,000 games, almost all of them directly to the general public. Its most successful title, the $50 a piece Trekking the National Parks, makes up the lion's share of that total, yet it's relatively unknown by most hobbyists. With results like that, there's always something to learn. And oh boy, did I learn a lot. I'm very lucky to have so many great guests on this podcast, but it's rare that I'm joined by one that actually makes me feel rather stupid, in the best possible way. This episode gave me a radically new perspective on what makes games successful. Nick is a smart heretic who comes from Underdog with a theory of what makes games sell that turns a lot of conventional wisdom in the board game industry completely on its head. What's more, I think he's probably right. Whether you're a designer or a publisher, I really think you can't afford to miss this one. Even if you don't end up agreeing with the kind of approach Nick is advocating here, I challenge you not to learn something from it. This one goes deeper than any conversation I've had before or heard before about what actually makes people buy games and the extensive lengths a company could go to find that game magic. That's worth any aspiring creator's time. We join just as I'm telling Nick why I was so keen to have this conversation.
Oh, thank you.
Particularly when it comes to the whole question of direct versus the kind of traditional model, because my experience is that a lot of people assume, okay, this is how board games are done. You do a Kickstarter, that's all you make a load of money up front, maybe, you get your game made, then either you leave it there, which is increasingly the business model of quite a few companies, or you then sell a remainder to distro. You don't want to get involved in retail, that's too complicated, maybe you've got a few retail pledges, and then maybe you hope you one day your game goes gangbusters. And then that's it. And yet, that model seems to have quite a lot of disadvantages to me.
It's got some problems, yeah, it does.
Right?
I want to caveat this conversation with a thing that's particular to our company that allows us to behave very differently from other companies.
Interesting.
Which is that we were founded by not a board game person. We were founded by an entrepreneur who is very good at e-commerce. And his expertise has allowed us to do things which I think at other publishers would be very risky for lack of expertise. But at our publisher, we can do it because we have this incredibly smart and knowledgeable person helming the ship,
So that immediately makes me want to know what he was doing before that. So, because
he was okay. So first of all, his name is Hassan Hasmani, and in fact, you probably once you hear about him will wish that you had him on instead of me. He's one of the most insightful people I've ever met in my entire life. He's in his mid-20s. He founded his company right out of college. He had already made his first million or something in college, doing board game arbitrage online.
Was he running an Amazon store or something like that?
Basically. Yeah. I mean, I probably shouldn't speak too much for him because, it's his story to tell. But so he's unbelievably good at creating a viable business. He was just doing this arbitrage out of his dorm room, and he's very sort of systems based person. And so he was seeing so much data about the way board games were moving through Amazon that he started to sort of build mental models of why things sell or don't, And because it was arbitrage, he was just like, he was making a lot of money, but he was just, sort of making a little bit of money on each game on a large volume. And I think, as I recall, he was like, well, if I became a publisher, then I could have a lot more of this margin. You know, I think that was the original motivation.
I think that I can't think of a motivation that's sort of more different to the typical board game story, where you'd have someone who's like, "Oh, I love these games. I really want to make my own game," and then sort of once they're actually got into the business, if they're smart, they realize they've got to educate themselves a bit about how things actually sell, how to sell online, all those questions, and then they eventually get to, well, if they do really really well at that, then they'll learn a lot of those things. But what we're saying is that Hassan is coming out of it from the point of view of, well, this is actually how things sell. This is the patterns that seem to be emerging about what sells and why things do and don't. I'd like that, but I'd like a bigger slice of the pie.
Yeah, right, exactly. I would also say that, like, I think one obstacle that a lot of people who start board game companies have is that they are sort of fundamentally creatives who feel they have to get into business in order to pursue their creative dreams. But there's actually a huge conflict between being a creative and running a business. Dispositionally, you need completely different things. So Hassan has the disposition to construct a beautiful business. I mean, his art is business making, and so like I've seen at other publishers struggles that we just don't have because Hassan is a unique bird in this world. You know.
So, I mean, and maybe let's explore that a little bit more, because I think that you're talking there about such a fundamental tension, because it's something I feel all the time. There are loads of games I really, really want to make. And I always describe myself as someone who loves board games 50% and loves business 50%. So I'm always torn between the things where I'd like to go, let's barrel off down this exciting direction from a kind of creative point of view, and this is really cool, let's make this a reality. And then the other half of me that's going, yeah, but okay, but be real, will that sell, will that work, what does the component cost look like realistically, what are the kind of margins, if you include this you're going to massively reduce that. And it's almost like I have to be a bit too brained the whole time.
Right. Exactly.
And I guess he can be a bit freer from that, because I guess if his, as you said, his art is business and working out how to make really successful businesses, then that is that, yeah, that's very interesting. It immediately makes me, or prompts me to ask rather, about how internally therefore product development works at Underdog, because
Yeah.
he's thinking, well, I was arbitraging board games anyway, now I want a bigger slice of the pie, and I think it's an exciting opportunity in selling direct to customer something that you've published. But obviously
Yeah.
then I guess the element that he wouldn't be able to bring to the table there would be the creative element about designing compelling games.
Exactly. So he actually originally, when he founded it, he partnered with an industry person, a game designer named Charlie Bink, who has been sort of the driving creative force of our company for a long time. He's the designer of our best-selling game called Trekking the National Parks, and his design sensibilities have sort of set the tone for what we do. And we've come to understand what we're trying to do through the reactions we see in customers to Charlie's games. And so, like our whole creative mandate sort of emerges from the partnership between Charlie's creativity and Hassan's business acumen.
So then is it the case that it's a pretty classic kind of vaguely Hollywood model where Charlie is proposing concepts and then Hassan is vetting them, or what does the development process look like?
Oh yeah, it's not that. It's so before we, I think I sent to you a document that sort of contained like our internal guidance about how we make games.
Yes, it's a kind of like, yeah, it's really interesting. It's like a kind of, this is so interesting because I haven't not seen really anyone else do this.
Yeah.
It's not just like transparent from the point of view of something like what Jamie Stegmaier does, where he's very transparent about his financials and broadly about his business in general. But what you're actually doing is saying, here's our kind of vision and set of beliefs about like how we work actually. So stuff that might be regarded, to be honest, really as sort of secret source, trade secrets kind of stuff. Certainly coming from looking, using that business part of my brain and looking at that. So yeah, that would be great if you could expand a little bit more on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that we believe really deeply is that themes matter a lot, right? More, I think, than maybe other publishers think. But finding and constructing an elite theme is as hard as constructing elite gameplay. And so an enormous amount of work goes in upfront to thinking about, ideating, and debating about themes. So for every game we publish, we've gone through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of concepts that we vetted and rejected. Yeah, and when we're vetting them and rejecting them, we're not thinking in terms of, do we like this? We're not thinking, hey, I mean, it is important that especially that whoever the designer is can draw inspiration from it. But the starting point is what will resonate with some very large identity group. And those things are very hard to find. And when people do find them, amazing things happen. And the classic example that we're all living under right now is Wingspan. I certainly didn't appreciate how pervasive birding was as an enthusiasm, as a hobby, as an identity, as it actually is. But Elizabeth knew.
Yeah, I mean, that's really fascinating, isn't it? I remember many years ago reading about how it was something like the second or third most popular hobby, or the second most popular hobby in the UK, and thinking, and this was long before Wingspan came out, and thinking, nah, come on, that's not real. And then actually, yeah, it is. I find that also really, really fascinating, because immediately the thing about Wingspan success that I think a lot about on this front is, it's a bit of a pet theory at the moment, but it's something Jara and I talk about a lot, which is that part of the problem with the Pareto distributions of game success. So, for example, something like, Wingspan is 54% of all of Stone Meyer's revenue, lifetime revenue as well, not just in a given year since 2019, since it was released, which is a staggering Pareto distribution of success. The problem can kind of become, and I wonder how much, the way that marketing momentum works, that once something is sort of 10% ahead of something else, it can, through sheer force of the rolling rock force of momentum, create outsized gains that are way beyond that.
For sure. I mean, it doesn't. I mean, a power law distribution essentially means that must be true, as I understand it.
Yeah, because otherwise, unless you think that in the underlying system there are some fundamental reasons why something is just genuinely that much better than something else. But I think that becomes then a really interesting question, because the extent to which that is true becomes a really interesting thing about your entire theory of success. Because if it's well, Wingspan is so dominant because it was a theme that was, say, I mean, I'm deliberately using crazy model numbers here because it's impossible to quantify this kind of thing. But let's say that it was 3 times more relevant than the next theme. Then you think that that's a pretty big part probably of its success, and then the momentum carries it the rest of the way. If you think it was only 30% more relevant than the next theme, or 10% more than the next theme, you've got a very different theory about is the distribution more about picking themes, or is it more about does the distribution suggest that it's more about that, or it's more about how you enable marketing momentum? And so that's what I just really assume when you said that about the role of theme. First, I think that's fascinating because that's going right in the face of, I would say, what most people in games, in the hobby game world, think. Because absolutely it's opposite logic, because they'd be saying, oh, no, the mechanics are what matters. It's gameplay is everything.
Yeah.
And actually you're saying, well, hold up a second there. Actually, maybe not.
Well, I would say this. It's not like we think theme is the only important thing.
Oh,
right?
of course. Yeah.
It's that there are a number of things which are necessary, but none of which are sufficient. And one of those things is gameplay. You can have an amazing game, but if other critical dimensions aren't excellent as well, it doesn't matter. And one of those dimensions is theme. That's an important one because the first experience, the very first point of contact that a customer will have with the game, their very first impression formed, will have nothing to do with the mechanics, and it will be everything to do with the theme and the way the thing looks, the way the box cover looks, right?
Yeah, totally.
if you think of the game itself as marketing for itself, and this is how I think, that first impression is the top of the funnel, the top of the marketing funnel. And so anybody who doesn't get through the top of that funnel doesn't get anywhere else. It's a gate you have to go through. And so keeping that gate big and open is vital.
Completely. Well, I mean, put that way, it sort of seems almost stunningly obvious, doesn't it? Because you can't perceive the gameplay directly. You either have to get it through a secondary source, like, oh, there's this reviewer I trust who says this is a good game. You have to trust a friend, or the only other way to get it is to actually play it.
Yeah. There's something else I want to say here, which is incredibly important that I think a lot of people miss, which is that when a person goes and buys a game, they are not buying it just for themselves. They have a crowd of people, friends, family, loved ones, other gamers that they are thinking of and about when they buy the game. And they're thinking to themselves, will this game be appealing to them? And if the answer comes up no, it doesn't matter how much they like it, they won't buy it. And so if a game punches you in the face with what it's about, and it's about something that a lot of people like, you have a much better chance of passing that gate than if you don't. So Wingspan is another amazing example of this, right? Not only is it about birds, but it's called Wingspan and it has a picture of a big bird on the cover and nothing else. And so it punches you in the face. Like, you know exactly what it's about. If you know somebody who likes birds, like, it's really obvious, like it could be a gift, or like we could play this together. If it was called like Dreams of Ornithology and it had a picture of a jungle with birds peeking out, it would be less. There's a moment of uncertainty that would create. And when you sell things, moments of uncertainty are poison for sales, right?
They're a complete disaster because this is the problem, isn't it? Well, I mean, again, this is this issue about everything. I mean, it's not just that there are so many games competing for people's wallets, even. It's that the total aggregate amount of attention that everything is competing for on your eyeballs all of the time, like regardless of what products they are, services, media, etc.
Yeah.
The more instantaneously you can say, here's this, it's birds. It's
Yeah,
birds.
exactly.
Like that's the moment you can do that. It's actually very, very it's very, very impactful. And as you said, I liked your title of Dreams of Ornithology because that sounds like exactly the kind of slightly more erudite but obscurist game title that I can just see being way less successful. You literally repackage the same product. I mean, and with Wingspan, it could probably actually measure that. Actually, you could do empirical experiments with something like that.
Yeah. I'd also say, like, this way of thinking can filter down into all kinds of like more specific production questions. Like, if you think about the way that people make first contact with games out in the wild, it's very often online, right? When a lot of publishers are like putting their boxes together, they are sort of thinking of the experience that you get like maybe in a bricks and mortar store, you know. But in fact, like a huge fraction of your first contact with the game is online. And when you do that, you're looking at a thumbnail. And so much of like the detail that you think is awesome when you're putting the game together is lost. And in fact, counterproductive because it makes the game look like mud. This is something we've struggled with a lot because we have a couple of games with themes that cannot, or we have not figured out how to represent them with single iconic images. And so like things like that we think about a lot.
So even to the extent where I guess in your development process, when you're kind of sifting through this vast number of possible thematic concepts, and you're looking for the kind of the few little diamonds kind of in the rough to work with, would this be another one of those filters that you're kind of applying to that? Would be like, can we turn it into something that's clearly iconographic?
It's something we talk about. However, it is so hard. It's so hard, or it has been so hard for us to find like true large identity group games that are underserved, that like when we find one of those, at least so far, we have been like, all right, we're going to make a game about this and we'll worry about the box cover representation later. But we also recognize this is causing us a problem. And this is a problem that we don't know how to fully address.
Well, I mean, that's very hard to predict up front, isn't it? Because if you're already going for the goal of find a large identity group, and then you're like, well, okay, partly because actually you're quite limited by your imagination as well, because it could be that you will find an iconographic solution to something, or it could be that you won't. That's really hard to know when it's just a concept.
You can't know up front, right? Yeah, exactly. Although you can get a better or worse idea for sure. I mean, there are some things where it is you can take comfort in the fact that it's obvious up front what it's going to be. Like, so we are going to publish a game this year called Her Story, HERSTORY, which is about like remarkable women of history. So you can guess what's on the box, you know?
Well, completely, absolutely, and I can see how that one goes straight to exactly what you're saying about large identity groups. You know, they'll think about women who want to see other historically prominent women who feel very strongly that there are women generally underrepresented in history, tapping into them. Particularly, it's an aspirational thing as well. Like that's I can see instantly how that fits what you're saying perfectly.
A lot of people want to give their daughters role models, you know?
Yes, completely, and that's like very powerful for that, right? So that fascinating. I love this. This is so completely opposite. It really is. Like the more you go into it, way of looking at it.
Yeah. I mean, especially the thing about Her Story, that identity group is half the world,
Yeah.
right? That's
Yes.
like as big an identity group as exists anywhere, and it's a passionate one, right? Especially now.
What yeah, but what I think is fascinating about it though is immediately raises questions for me, right? Which is that what defines the identity group? Because one of the things, in some ways, the wingspan example is quite nice because it's quite it's pretty simple, I think, as an example. Whereas what's interesting about this one straight away is that I can see how, although theoretically the audience is 50% of the world, and on some level it is, but actually probably the group that will respond exceptionally positively to that
Yeah.
is itself actually probably
Less.
a much smaller group. And by the way, still not a small group, by the way, but a much smaller group in terms of, because obviously not so much 4 billion people, but very much, but a smaller group than that, because it will be much more appealing to people who have a certain set of socio-political assumptions. And there
For
will be
sure, yeah. I would want to say you pointed to something a minute ago that I think is really important. Understanding identity groups is hard. So
yeah,
I'm sitting
yeah.
here I'm sitting here talking like I understand what I'm doing, you know? Um,
Yeah.
but it's true that every time we make a game, and especially with that one, we're making a bet. You know, it's more akin to like stepping up to the plate in a baseball game, and maybe you connect and maybe you don't. And your goal is to raise the frequency with which you connect, or the probability with which you connect with the ball. But in terms of like knowing, you can't prospectively know if you've really tied what you've done into the identity well enough to make it work.
Oh, completely. Well, because necessarily, which is we are in reality a kind of multiplex of many overlapping identities that makes this really fascinating. Also, to some extent, the identities. Oh, I mean, this is great, right? We're getting into really philosophical territory here. I love this. Sort of both exist and don't exist, in the sense that they are. What we're really talking about is something like a construct about a group of people, the real world corollary of which is like a vast amount of different thoughts and feelings that kind
Yes.
of tend to occur together and tend to be somewhat clustered and associated in individual human minds. And the hope is that that particular clustering and set of thoughts and feelings and associations is shared enough over a wide population group, and we kind of call that an identity.
Yeah. And not only that, I would say it's also not just, it's like the tenor of some of those thoughts and feelings may matter as well. So this is, if I can refer back to her story. So like a lot of people play games. This is like if I'm sort of doing a pre-mortem on Her Story. Let's assume Her Story fails, and right now I'm going to do a pre-mortem, and I'm going to try to like predict why it fails if it fails. Um, it seems to me a lot of people buy games as a kind of there's an element of escapism in it, and this ties into the aspirational nature of board games as well. So our best-selling game is Trekking the National Parks. It's pleasurable to play because the idea of going to the parks is a very pleasurable idea in itself to people, right? Her story is about a topic which is at this moment in some way contentious, or at least adjacent to it. I mean, our game is a straight history game. It's just about like remarkable women who've done remarkable things. But the halo of associations around like all women's issues right now seem very tense, you know. And it could be that, so even though there's a large identity group, the particular tenor of the feelings maybe aren't right for a board game. I don't know.
So yes, because of course that's the issue, is that there are lots of identity. Yes, there's a funny one, isn't it? It's both. There might be identity groups, because we've assumed obviously that we could, at the first, I guess, that, or the very basic model, rather, that's the better way to put it, would be that there are infinite number of identity groups. You can make a game that will sell to any identity group, and the problem is really on the commercial side is a problem of, have you got a big enough identity group? But actually, what's really interesting is that even if you can find an identity group, can you present to something an experience they want to indulge in that a board game can deliver on, that has the correct positive associations?
Yes, I mean that's a whole other thing that we shouldn't lose sight of. Like none of this matters if the game isn't fun to a ton of people.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You know, so that's another thing where like we think in terms of necessity but not sufficiency. And I think it's actually really easy for a company like ours to get to think that if you nail all like the identity stuff, you're going to be fine. But that's not true at all, right? Like there are so many games in the world, you have to create something exceptionally fun to get traction. And the magic is in like the unification of all these different factors that go into making the product.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean that. Well, that absolutely, of course, every time it's the unification of all the factors. What's really interesting though is that what I kind of find really fascinating is it seems like almost your company has like a, which I guess we've kind of talked about already, but just to kind of really like zoom in on it specifically. Like the theory is something like, look, the real business is about identifying these themes that resonate with identity groups, on the kind of assumption that to some extent the gameplay problem kind of will always get solved. Because obviously if you viewed things the opposite, in opposite world, the other way around, you'd say, well, look, the really tough thing is, and the really critical thing is nailing the game mechanics, and you can always solve the theme problem.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I struggle with this myself. So in choosing the theme first, there's like a good side and a bad side, as I understand it. The good side is once you understand the theme a little bit and the way that people relate to the theme and the things the experiences they like wish they had around that theme. And we know all these things because we interview customers like extensively and do a lot of like customer analysis before we even make a game.
When you say extensive, how much are we going to talking about here?
So I probably do, for each game before we make it, I'll do like 14 interviews, but they're in-depth interviews about. And then also we also typically do a thing where let's say we have, after we winnow all of our hundreds of concepts down to like 5 or something like that. We'll send those to big customer list. We have a really big list because we're e-commerce, and then we say like, okay, if you're gonna pick one of these games that you want us to make, which one do you pick, and more importantly, why? And then we'll get thousands of comments back for the winner, and then like we read those comments like they're the Talmud, like trying to get at the meaning behind the words, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so by the time we get to making a game, like we actually understand quite a bit about the way that like large groups of people relate to the idea. And that gets turned into a set of constraints on game design. And as you know, constraints on game design are great because then you don't have a blank sheet of paper, then you have like something to hinge off of. So that's the good side. The bad side, and I think we experienced this with this game Her Story that I'm telling you about, is some themes just seem more conducive to making a game of them than others. So like when I tell you we're going to make a game called Her Story about remarkable women of history, that does not by itself immediately suggest to you mechanisms or any mechanistic framing about what you as the player are doing in the game.
No.
And so like one problem we had was we spent so the amount of the amount of resources that we put into making this game is so obscene. I'm like I'm too embarrassed to even like say numbers, so I won't. But one of the reasons for that is like figuring out what like how to connect it to game mechanics was brutally difficult. You know?
Yeah. Oh yeah, like it's really interesting you say that, because as you were kind of leading up to that point, I was thinking, yeah, like what? I don't have any immediate ideas. Now, if I compare that, say, for example, with Magnate, one of the interesting things about that was that the moment the game concept came together, like almost instantaneously, several key mechanical ideas just instantly came to being. Because they were like, well, okay, it's property. That means it's all about how things, physical space interacts, and different kinds of businesses and occupiers near each other have to interact. So it's spatial. Great. It's financial. So there's got to be a market crash, because that's what everyone thinks about property, is like, when is the bubble going to burst? Done. Right. Actually, that turned out to be a much harder problem. But at least where you would take it was kind of fairly instantly obvious, because the theme suggested certain mechanical approaches straight away. Like, it's not like the moment you think of a city builder, it's going to have some spatial element, right? Probably. Whereas this one, it's that the moment I thought about that was really interesting, is I thought, well, part of the issue is that it's you're taking something and saying, here is something that here's some stories of some incredible women, but the stories have already been written.
Yep.
And so anything that's like past facing rather than future facing, and I mean that in terms of not necessarily past in terms of historical, but I mean like in the Ludo narrative position of the player. Are you kind of looking back at the past, or are you looking towards the future? Because if you're a merchant in 17th century Germany, let's say, because that would be a good old fashioned Eurogame theme, something like that. You at least like, I'm my own future ahead of me as the merchant is I'm trying to make as much money as possible. So there's like a kind of like a simulation and a set of experiences that suggest themselves. Whereas with this, I can see straight away, it's like, oh, there's not really a set of things that suggest themselves. You're going to have to come at this a little bit more brute force, probably.
Yeah. It caused a lot of pain to get at it. Like we actually worked with some outside designers who I idolize, like my heroes, and we frustrated them because it was just like, oh, make another. This isn't working. Make another version that's totally different. Make another version that's totally different. And so probably made 35, 40 different unique conceptual games until we like hit on something that we felt was right.
Wow. Okay.
And we wouldn't have had to do that if it was a game that suggested mechanics more readily,
So what's fascinating is, so it's really interesting as you said this, I had this, you were just talking about your model. I suddenly gave me a slight weird sense of embarrassment, because I was thinking like, oh my God, what we tend to do is we do see loads of ideas. We do iterate through quite a lot of ideas. I don't think we're especially structured about it, but we get to a point where something feels like, oh, hang on, if this is a hot one, this sounds good. And then we spend enough time with it until we think, yeah, actually, let's explore this further and then play it. But we have no kind of real framework of something like that for it. I think we would definitely take a more old-fashioned, in some sense, quite organic approach to trying to determine that. But I can also see that the one advantage that very organic approach has is that it is very lean from a product development investment point of view. And the thing you're saying straight away is like, and theoretically, right, it would be the better approach if you were some kind of magic thermometer who could always go, I feel like this is the one, and then pick the correct theme. Having one person who could just do that would always be much more cheap. And the whole point of coming up with a framework is that you want to be able to like, and this is the critical thing that makes it business rather than just art, isn't it? The problem is the soul of art is often about unique individual creations where the creator has a personal relationship to them, and the art of business is, can you make this reproducible and scalable? And so whenever in any entertainment business, these things are always like smashing into each other. And so you've got a fascinating thing here of like, well, we've got this process that's like, actually, so far you seem to have proven can reliably produce games, but my God, is it expensive sometimes, because you're talking about getting through 30 or 40 of those, as you said, those individual games, whereas a typical process would be the complete about face. I know lots of people who basically commission designers to say, right, they go to a famous designer and go, right, we want a game by you because we know if we slap your name in the box, it will sell at least some units.
Yeah.
And then that designer generally sells them a game, and it's maybe not one of their most favorite concepts. It's like one they've got in a drawer, And it won't even cost them that much, actually, to buy that concept off that designer. It will be sometimes very cheap to do that. And it really amazed me when I started having private conversations. And I won't say any numbers I know because they're commercially sensitive information people have told me, but I will say they are surprisingly cheap.
Yes.
And then they just go, right, push the button. Whereas you're saying, well, actually, the gamble is on, funnily enough, the machine is aiming to become a non-gamble because you've got this reliable way to produce things. But I guess the problem is the gamble is that actually itself on this concept of this process is that you can develop things is that the costs don't escalate beyond all imagination by the fact that you have to go through 40 different like things, which is like just a lot of hours of designer time you're paying for.
Right. Now, I mean, her story taught us a lot in that regard. Like, I don't think we can ever again spend as much money and labor on making a game as we did for her story. So like, we have to change if we don't want to take too much risk. So we're going to be weighing more heavily that sort of thing going into the future. And the things we're working on now are much more, the connection between concept and gameplay is like way easier. But all of this is to say, like, okay, so we think in these Pareto terms, right? So the question is, like, what is the best way to get to the top of that Pareto curve? And you can think there's two ways you can think about it. Take a whole bunch of cheap shots on goal and hope one goes in, or you can like try to think really deeply to try to take a few really great shots on goal and then like market the ever living shit out of them. And so we've obviously taken the latter approach, but I don't know it's the right approach. I do know that it does inspire people in our company. So there's a big difference in the psychology of a group when if you say to the group, we have to do the best work of our lives to survive. We have to rally around the idea that we're going to be the best we've ever been right now. That's a lot more exciting than we're going to pump out a bunch of shit and see what happens.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. Well, one of those is imbued with mission, right? It's something where, and it's inspiring because actually you're going to work hard to see an amazing payoff. And the other one says, it's okay. It's hard to have much pride in the other one because you're saying the other one is like, it's okay if we pump out some crap because what matters is constantly taking the shot on gold. And I actually think that the issue about this one, and I think the reason why I feel like the industry is, to my mind, from what I'm seeing, is tending towards actually not anything like, by the way, the specifics of what you're talking about in terms of identity groups and that strategy, because I think that's still very, very alien to a lot of the way that people think at the moment about this. But the idea of, look, let's just broadly speaking, a smaller number of better things that are more likely to be successful, because the other strategy is like, it's too expensive, actually. Because the problem with the other strategy is that it's because actually you have a cheaper version of it already, which is your cheaper version is, let's iterate through 400, 500 theme concepts. Probably 40 games was too much, but maybe 10, I don't know, 5 to 10 distinct game concepts.
Yeah.
And all of those are way cheaper at that stage to develop than actually 40 different games. Because 40 complete games isn't just labor and it isn't just brainstorming time. It's like all of the project management, the manufacturing, real materials being purchased, all of those things. So it's like a question of like, well, to some extent, everyone's strategy is actually
costly in different ways. Yeah.
Yes. And everyone's strategy is to some extent throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, because no one is like a perfect thermometer for game success. They can't just be like, right, well, I know this one's a winner, and then develop that one game, and then bam, make $1 million with it. Means that actually everyone is to some extent having to take somewhere in the funnel is deciding, well, do we produce lots of things or a few number of things? And the difference is that the companies who probably have a theory that there's kind of no way to be successful and that it's all luck. So in fact, if we go back earlier to what we talked about earlier, that their theory would be that Wingspan is no better than anything else. It's like 1% better maybe. And then that just happened to spiral. And that happened to spiral could have been on any other set of reasons. It might have been because of the way that the weather that day. It could have been, what was recently in the newspapers or on the TV. It has very little to do with Wingspan's fundamental quality as a product in any sense. Would say, oh well, given that, then you might as well make complete games, and you keep buying the scratch cards, right, over and over and over again.
Yeah, that may be true. I don't know. I will say that for me personally, I used to be a scientist and I'm driven by a desire to learn. So like I don't think I could do this if I felt like there was no hope of learning and improving. And so the just emotionally the idea of just throwing stuff out until something happens is like a big turnoff for me. You know, I'd rather like die on the hill of trying to learn and failing than not trying to learn.
Oh, completely. Like I've had conversations with some publishers who definitely buy into the kind of random theory, and ultimately all of these are theories because there is no laws of physics that are applicable at this scale to this problem. Like there's no way for us to go to carry out the perfect experiment where we create multiple complete copies of Earth, and then we can simulate all of the different things, the different game releases, until we get to the one that the underlying laws about why games succeed or don't succeed. So to some extent, we all have different interpretations of this same messy universe of games. What I would say about the problem with the random theorists is that it's maybe not viable on the simple level that it's so expensive as an approach to take. And I think that because a lot of the companies that, let's be honest, okay, I'm going to talk about one company that I will specifically name here because it's one that's already gone bust, and that's Tasty Minstrel Games. They owned, to my mind, maybe one actual blockbuster, something like Orleans, I think. And then basically they owned a couple other quite famous games. And when I said to someone, they got upset because they said, no, Tasty Minstrel make loads of good stuff. But actually, to be honest, when I looked at their back catalogue, I was like, they don't have that many really good games here. And it seemed like their theory probably was, and I can't speak for them too much, but just based on their output, seemed like their theory was, well, we just have to keep publishing stuff. And then if we have enough hits, then that pays for the losses, and then we're okay. And I thought it was fascinating because years ago, I remember kind of tweeting about this and talking about how that was kind of, for example, used to be like Hollywood's business model. And they moved past that because they fundamentally have the same pressures, which is that it's so expensive to write, kind of create, produce, film, edit, release, and distribute, and then market. Doing it to every idea is not going to be viable. And it only would make any kind of sense if you truly believe that all success is utterly random.
I think there's a historical reason that companies do this. So I think I think this is just my belief. I believe that the make a bunch of things and see what happens model worked a lot better like 10, 15 years ago. So I mean Z-Man Games, right? They became huge by doing that until pandemic happened. The problem now is the number of games published each year is much higher, and the ambitions of the people who make them, at least some of them, is higher. There's more like sharks in the water. And I think that means that the probability of throwing something out and having it work has shrunk so much that it's not nearly as viable a way of thinking as it used to be.
So I think you're right. I think that's a really important point. Is that this is it. The reason why that strategy is now looking like it's really creaking is because of the way the market has matured, and that strategy was actually perfectly viable before in a world of much less choice.
Exactly. And the second thing related to that, the world of communicating about everything has become busier. And part of the Pareto curve is visibility, right? So if I make a million games, so if I make 10 games and I have a marketing budget, I can only put 1/10 of my marketing budget into each game. Like there's a Pareto law of visibility as well. The most visible things get more visible and everything else falls away.
So what we end up with is a kind of product development funnel in which that gets much bigger at the top, probably because you need to iterate through more concepts to be really sure that the bets you're making are good bets.
Yeah. I mean, and you can never be sure. So this is like the specific math of it, which we don't really know matters, right? So it depends on how much are you raising the probability for all that work you put into the one thing. We don't know. I will say that our company has been very successful so far doing this. So until we fall apart in some kind of way, which may happen, we're probably going to keep going.
So yeah, it's like effectively every time. Again, talking from using a scientific analogy, at least every time you're effectively you're reperforming the experiment, and you're hopefully increasing the number of data points, and you're getting to the issue where you're getting to the point where, okay, this model looks hopefully more stable. So the first game you do it with, it really is just a theory.
Okay, yeah, actually, I have to interrupt here too as well, because does not characterize the way that we think about what we're doing internally.
Oh,
So
interesting.
our number one value in our company is constant improvement. So every time we make a game according to our model, regardless of the results, the most important thing is to iterate on the model. So, like, if you were talking to me a year from now about the theory that we have under which we publish games, it'll look different. And if it doesn't look different, we have definitely failed.
So, okay, so now you raise something really interesting, right? Because I mean, we're maybe getting to some really more obscurest philosophy at this point, but screw it, let's try it anyway. The issue is, I guess, if you could perform your experiment much more rapidly, you could iterate this whole experiment on the game model. You'd want to do it like thousands of thousands and thousands of times, or whatever number you could pluck out there, but a very large sample size number, and then you would know that this model was a model that was correct. But the funny problem is that you have the same problem that everyone else has, actually, which is you don't actually have time to spend 20 years working out whether or not the model works
Because the world changed in the meantime.
because the world changed in the meantime. And this is the fascinating problem again of why it's so funny, isn't it? That one of the big problems about and it was why I will just mention very offhand way, which we can't afford to discuss because we're already going on a few tangents here, but why I have quite a lot of cynicism about quite a lot of the social sciences. Because I have this problem of like, yeah, but the whole global cultural context and economic context is shifting so much that the problem is that coming to stable findings about anything like this is so challenging because and this is where ironically why I think people often underrate the power of gut, because they're not seeing that actually the kind of scientific approach in domains like this, unlike when you're studying the fundamentals of the universe and the galaxy, oh great, you've got a lot of stable data, but when you're talking about this, it's so unstable, it's actually quite hard to make these kind of predictions. So actually, anyway, regardless, you apply these principles in order to be a bit more robust in thinking, but actually you're updating the model regardless.
Exactly. Yeah. So to the point about gut, I may push back on that a little bit.
Oh, okay, go for it.
I mean, I do think that there are people whose guts work great, right? Because because their guts are so aligned with the zeitgeist that they can follow their instincts and it works. But you have to be one of those people in order for that to work, and there are very few of us. Like, the chances are that any given one of us is vanishingly small. I'm very jealous of them. I know people who work at Exploding Kittens, and I know that, like, the two guys who run Exploding Kittens, like, they just say, like, yeah, this, our gut says that this is the product, and there's like way less vetting that we do, but their guts seem to be so aligned with the zeitgeist that it works quite well, and it's hyper efficient, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? It's like, and I guess in terms of what we mean by gut here, right? Because if you're talking presumably at the level of like whole game concept and proposition, rather than so much like gut, I guess I'm thinking this slightly more broadly there, and in terms of its applicability to lots and lots of small individual business decisions that you don't necessarily have time to experiment on. But I think if we talk in more practical, immediate terms, it seems like what you're doing is really, really interesting because it's taking like a really core problem to which the answer really, really matters, right? Like you need to know if this, you really want to have the best possible shot you can at that game resonating with identity groups. And unless you happen to know that you had, as you said, that kind of hyper aligned to zeitgeist guts, you just couldn't afford to make that gamble. So this is a critical domain, right? To really be a lot more certain and not trust gut on its own.
Yeah. One thing you can do. So I mentioned interviews, right? It's not like we just do interviews every once in a while. Like, we're trying to do interviews all the time. But the consequence of that is that if the way our customers talk starts to change, we'll hear it, and we'll hear it from them, and our model will change as a result.
I'm really interested to know. I mean, yeah, exactly. You're updating that. What I'm interested to know, and more practically and more specifically, then what these design constraints for designers look like, because it almost sounds like that the constraints you're giving them are like, give me this kind of relationship to concept, and they're very much sounding like experiential rather than say classic ones people think about constraints as like I'm going to give myself a mechanical constraint or something like that, or a component constraint.
That is exactly right. Like, experiential constraints are much more important than the more nuts and bolts constraints, because the experiential constraints, that's the customer's experience, right?
Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
the thing that matters for sales. The other stuff is, means to ends.
Well, the thing is, it even matters, doesn't it, to on a fundamental level to how much fun they have. Even if you weren't interested, if you see this purely, which is completely legitimate, my perspective, if you see this purely as art rather than business, that kind of still feels like that would be where you were at. And it's interesting how it seems like people today have more of an idea that that is important. But I don't think even when I started a few years ago, like I felt like, oh yeah, the experiential constraints would be the critical constraints, is something that people maybe were thinking about a lot, and even maybe today not as much as they could.
I think part of that comes from the fact that, like, we were talking about the tension between like creatives and business. Like when you're a creative, one of the reasons you become a creative is so that you can like sort of follow your internal visions, which are very seductive to you. And they're so you have to like it's hard to take yourself out of that as a creative and then try to live inside the mind of another person whose lived experience is very alien to you. That can be, I mean, I think that's a struggle that we have a little bit, which is, like we try to like become our customers, like understand them so deeply that we can think like them. But it's uncomfortable for your creative to go through that process.
Well, yeah, because you're going so completely into inhabiting someone else, and you're putting your own. I think particularly when it comes to the self-expression aspects of art, you are putting that aside specifically. Because I think to some extent it's a process to me that seems to fit quite well with the empathic dimension. I mean, that's something that I find really interesting. Is like one of the reasons I love creating games is because I like to kind of create something that helps someone feel a certain way. That to me, actually, that's more important than executing my ideas. Increasingly, I'm actually less and less bothered by those. I am finding myself, there are game concepts I've had which I really like, but I have noticed maybe increasingly, or maybe I've always been to some extent this way. I am very happy to shoot my own ideas without really a moment of remorse. So, and I find that creative aspect of kind of creating experience for people just fundamentally more interesting.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, the act of having to get really close to people to understand them. So I've had to practice my listening a lot. And there are moments in interviews that have like made me like almost it filled me with something that I never really felt, thinking more internally creatively. So like, for example, there's one interview I did with a dad who had set up a tent in his living room to play Trekking the National Parks with his kid. And in the middle of him describing this setup that they had and like how, like, what a sacred space it was inside this tent, he started to like choke up and cry. And like that made me choke up and cry. And it made me think like, wow, my company has played a role in this, like, the relationship between I'm getting choked up now. The relationship between a father and child is so sacred, Um, so like it's not just products. Like if you can get to that, you can be a part of that. That's as profound as it gets.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. I mean, that's to me, I'm with you that that seems like the real dream, right? Where you're able to help people create those kind of moments. Wow. Like it's gone well beyond just that was a fun game, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So once it hits you that there are people out there who you've helped in that way, then it gets a lot easier to leave your own like internal creative visions and think, how do I do that again?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because that seems like such a concrete achievement creatively, right? Like it's not just like, well, I talked about something. It's like, oh, I made people feel that and they loved that, right? That's so real. And I think that's yeah, I feel like that's the bit that one is really chasing. I mean, that's something I think we, just for example, in our product development meeting that I was in earlier today, that is very much what we were trying to do. We have a kind of feeling that I guess we're trying to recreate, which is that this game is like sitting around a table playing like an action RPG with your friends, right? And it's creating a particular kind of frenzied flow state that you're kind of all part of. And that's really interesting because I think like that's not something that I've seen almost any game quite do. And that's very much what we're trying to do with this one. Is like create that moment where it's all they're in this incredible moment where they're having that kind of same feeling they have in like that of like a beautiful turn in a card game where everything has just all the effects are synergizing at once together. But you're doing that collectively, and you are doing it all in this moment of like with this time pressure that is onto you, so that you get those kind of like, it's like a moment in almost like a moment in a video game where you pull off some incredible thing where you jump off a platform, you shoot a guy, you somersault, you land on something, and you just have this sense of rush. Like that is kind of very much what we're trying to create there.
That sounds like a hard thing to do.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. It definitely fits into our kind of ambitious about games mantra. Like this is my thing, and again, I think it's not necessarily perfectly aligned to what would be the most commercial thing to do, but is like, I guess, is like a strong internal value for us. Is like everything we do has to be in some sense ambitious, and I think this one is very strongly like that. It's like, okay, this is quite difficult to pull off, like a heavy real time experience.
Have you studied the game Pendulum?
It's one of the ones on my list of things to look at a little bit more closely while we're in the development process. It's not one I've looked at so far, but I understand it tries to do something a little bit like that.
I would say to me it's interesting because it tried and then appears from the outside to have totally not met expectation. So I remember, I follow Jamie like everybody else does, and I remember when he first started talking about it, he mentioned that at the little mini convention in St. Louis that he runs, Pendulum had like the best playtester score of any game they've ever had there. And then, but when it went to market, it's like it might be the worst selling game. It's not doing great compared to the other Stegmaier games, as I understand it. I mean, maybe if Jamie listens to this, he'll call me up and say that I'm an idiot because I'm wrong. But that's what it looks like from the outside.
It's not tremendously well selling. I think it might be the worst actually. I think it is actually, because I remember looking at his numbers because I was really interested in like crunching them and looking at his data to see what he's doing. I think it is. I mean, obviously it's worse selling for a Stonemaier product, so I still think it's shifted like 17,000 units or something. But for him, that is a pretty low number.
Yeah, I have some. I was thinking about Pendulum, and I wonder if the real time nature of the game itself is the problem. I bring this up because this would be a concern for you too. So just for example, okay, so like your first play experience is a very important signpost to determine whether or not you're going to go online and like say you love the game or not, right?
Oh, increasingly, dare I say, critical.
Right. Okay, so one of the biggest problems with board games is you have to learn rules before you play them, right? So the analogy that I give is like, imagine if before you watched a movie you had to read 10 pages of instructions about how to watch it. Like the movie industry would be 1/10 the size that it is.
100%, yeah.
Yeah. So by far the biggest obstacle to board game adoption is learning rules. Now, you sit somebody down and you say, not only do you have to experience the normal intimidation and disgruntlement that you feel with having to like learn all these rules, but now you have to do it under time pressure. That seems to me like a recipe for a bad first player experience for a lot of people.
Oh my God, 100%. It's really interesting. So one of the things that we've sort of already designed into the game is we have a sort of tutorial mini adventure that the characters go on, and the first part of that is not timed. And I think a critical thing was to get players to do all of the game mechanics where there's like a different constraint that's just for this scenario that's quite simple and very much like the constraints you get in the real game, that doesn't constrain the time initially when you're playing the learning scenario, because I think that is I think you're so right. And I think this general question of tutorials is to me fascinating. So obviously I am a huge believer that we have to keep trying to crack the rulebook problem.
Yep. Oh my God. Wow. Yeah. We agree. We're very aligned on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it is a huge problem. Like, as you said, in no other space am I told right now, before you watch this movie, you must mandatorily read a document about the making of the production, a bit about how to view it, about so and things. You've got to understand this element of it. You've got to, oh my God, as you said, the movie industry will be nowhere like near the size.
Right. And oh, by the way, when you watch the movie for the first time, you're going to be cross-referencing with the rules the whole time. So you're going to have to watch it a second time if you really want to like get at the fun of it.
Oh God, yeah, a nightmare, right? And I think the interesting thing about this is that we and the only reason that we accept this now is because very simply no one has yet come up with a single consistent approach, and maybe no single consistent approach will ever be found, that solves this problem. And all the attempts to do it are all like, let's be honest, I'm going to be completely brutal here, are I think a bit inadequate. So, for example, the generic solution of learn to play videos. Some people talk about those as if that just solves the problem. No way does that solve the
Does
problem.
not. Yeah, not at all.
Like I personally hate them. I actually, some of them, by the way, sometimes they're really useful resources. And we had one from Magnate, for example, done by Girls Game Shelf, and Monique was exceptional. She did an amazing job. She got all the mechanics across, the core mechanics across in 10 minutes. Brilliant, really great. However, that still wouldn't be my preference. My preference would still be actually always a friend of mine teaches me the game. That would always be my preference, not a video. And actually, there are times where if the video is going to be like a 25-minute teach video, I'm sorry, I'll just bite the rule book off instead. Actually, at that point, and even though I loathe reading rule books. They really annoy me because I still find, however my brain works, despite the number of games I've played, I find it very hard to imagine how it plays out from the rule book. And when reviewers tell me, "Oh, I just read the rule book to get a sense of if I like it," I'm like, that is to me that seems like a really poor signal to noise ratio. And anyway, so you have to go through this learning process, and I feel like if there was a way that you didn't have to touch the rule book, you could just open the box, play the game straight away. That just has to be superior.
Yep. I would say that so the solution therefore will never be found in making a game and then writing the rule book after the fact. It's more that you are designing the game so that you can start playing it before you know all the rules comfortably.
So now this is really interesting because if you can, let's say you can truly design that, the issue, I guess, that would be an amazing achievement if it's a relatively complex game, because I think for some simple games that may be already achievable. And I know you've been doing some really interesting stuff on your own blog where you've posted about the some of the very deliberately hyper simple abstract games that you've been designing that I can imagine begin to breach that territory. But I can imagine on anything even slightly complex that this would so constrain design space. I don't know. My slight cynicism about that is that comes from, I think that if I look at what's happened in video games, they still have to attack the problem from multiple sides. So they've long ditched manuals, but I've noticed that they normally got a sort of two-punch strategy where they go one in with, let's make this just as intuitive to understand as possible by using great UX principles about what people are familiar with, familiar concepts, but also inevitably tutorializing some of the content as well.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's tough. I don't know. Yeah, and even we make quite simple games, and even so, we still haven't managed to do this. So I don't really know. I mean, there are examples out there in the world. I remember, like Flux was kind of like that way back in the day. I believe Friedman Freeze designed a couple of games where it's like there's no rule book. I think it was him. I don't want to misspeak. Somebody, maybe him,
It could
design
be
one where like all you have a deck of cards, you turn over the first card, you do what it says, and the rules unfold through the cards themselves.
I think there's definitely, he's got one where the victory objectives and the structures of the game change depending on what you drew out at the beginning. That was like that. I remember talking to another guest, David Weiss, over at the Daily Worker Placement, and he told me very much. He was telling me about one of those games, and it was really interesting, as a very much in that kind of like cool experimental art piece kind of probably sector. But then again, that's where often you find the ideas that eventually you can turn into something that's a little bit more applicable more broadly with enough thought. I mean, oh yeah, I find this question about tutorials fascinating. We did one for Magnate, And what's been fascinating about it has been the response to it. So it has been one of the most polarizing aspects of the game. So maybe the single most polarizing aspect.
Oh, wow! This is exactly what I would have predicted. This is fascinating. So some people like it, some people don't.
So the comments range from, on the negative side, how dare you put this in the box? It's a total waste of time. You wasted my time. You wasted everyone else's time for a game that shouldn't have a tutorial because it's far too simple. And how dare you, long criticism in a podcast that I listen to this is a masterstroke. This should win some kind of board game Nobel Prize because it solves the problem, finally, of a middleweight game that you can just open and play. Incredible. And it's like, whoa.
Yeah, what do you do with that?
So what we've actually done for the second edition, which is really interesting, it's not the second edition, it's the second printing. We're not changing anything other than this one feature of the game, is we've put a little leaflet in the top of the box that basically gets players to choose whether they learn with the tutorial or the rulebook, and encouraging them to basically pick the one that's going to suit them, depending on what learning kind of approach to learning games they like. So it basically says on one side, look, if you just want to unseal and play, you don't want to do any prep, you don't mind sitting there for a while and the first couple of turns are scripted, but you want to understand the game really well, if more of this tickles your fancy, then I think you should pick the tutorial. And then the other side says, look, if you play loads of games, you quite enjoy reading rule books, you don't have any problem with it, and you don't mind if you get things wrong sometimes, then if more of these apply, I think you should pick the rule book. And we recommend you don't use the tutorial. And I'm really interested to see. I mean, obviously, this is just our first attempt at doing some kind of like structured learning path thing where we get the players to pick one or the other. I'm interested to see what the effect of this one is going to be. It's with the sample size that we're going to have. It's not going to be like it's a scientific thing, but I'm hoping to get back some feedback that hopefully people will. Hopefully, if it works, people will say, "Oh, this is pretty good," because it made sure that I picked the, and then they'll be happy with either approach because also the expectations of the approaches have been set better as well. Like the tutorial is better than me at teaching Magnate. Like honestly, the quality of learning people have in the game is superior because it doesn't forget a single detail.
Yeah, I would like to see how you did it. I don't know if you're willing to share files, but I'd really like to see that.
Oh yeah, totally. I will. I think if it's not already up on BGG, it should be just as a free downloadable file. So I will absolutely share that with you because yeah, it's effectively a 5-player game that you play the first like 2 turns of completely scripted. But what it does is it kind of tutorializes things by getting you to play a quiz. So you go through it. It says, right, based on what you know, how does this bit work? And then people have to decide as a group, and then they flip the next card to reveal what the answer is. So it becomes like a kind of like because for me it was like, well, knowing I've worked a little bit in education, and making the process a much more active learning process would A, be more engaging, and B, it would fix the knowledge much better. So it turns into a bit more of a mini game of itself, of like, and people feel really good about it when you see them because they're like, oh, well, I think the correct number of dice that we're going to roll is this based on that, and then they flip it and they see they're right, and they're like, oh, great, yeah, I understand the game because I predicted what was going to be the rule of how this rule applies, and I was right, and the game's giving me that feedback. And then what it does is it starts going, right, well, the next round, that's the first round. The second round goes, right, we're going to be a little bit more hands-free this time. We're going to tell you it's still scripted. We're going to tell you what your actions are, but you just got one card that tells you what they are. And it does a little mock bidding round where the information is secret from each other. So you get a little bit of a simulation of an auction, of a turn order auction.
Yeah. Huh. Fascinating.
Then it gets to finally, right, from this round onwards, you are doing it completely on your own. Flip the last couple of cards when you come to the end with the bit you need to know about how the end works that we're not going to explain to you now. And then it does a little, and then because it was running a little bit long, what it does now, what it also does or has always done, is you just basically rearrange the risk cards that trigger the crash, and you change some of the board state stuffs to make sure that it speeds the game up, so you kind of catch up again, to bring it in a still reasonable teaching game length. So that it was an enormous amount of work to make it work, but it was a very interesting process.
Okay. Huh. And have you done a lot of blind play testing of this format to get a bead on how it's going to work?
Yeah, so it was actually sort of interesting. It was actually in some ways, I think it was weirdly perfect timing for us, strangely. So over the pandemic, obviously we couldn't easily playtest in person with people. So what we did was we sent out a game, and then what people would do, lots of different groups agreed to this. It was so great. It was so helpful. These different volunteers, they would play Magnate. We would have a webcam trained on them, and then we would watch them live, try and learn the tutorial from scratch.
Awesome. Yeah, yeah. That having that webcam is so important.
Yeah, because it was like watching people's body language, seeing who was engaged, who wasn't as engaged, watching like them like get things right. How long were they looking at some things? Were they struggling with others? Like all of this, and we do that. So we do that loads and loads and loads of times. It was laborious as hell, but it did mean that I think we ended up with something that I think is pretty good. And I do feel like the problem has primarily been about expectation setting for the tutorial and about getting people doing the tutorial who shouldn't be doing the tutorial.
Yeah.
And I had underrated before we started how much it could piss people off.
Right. Yeah. You also, I mean, you're in a difficult spot because your games are heavy enough that they're played by pretty seasoned and heavy gamers. You know. Yeah, I can see where there's conflict there.
Like 100%. Like it was challenging, and I think particularly because Magnate is probably more medium weight than some of those gamers expect. I think that led them to choose the tutorial when they should have done, because they just assumed it was going to be some super monster that was going to be from a complexity perspective, and actually it lands somewhere in the middle.
That's awesome. Cool.
So is tutorialization something that you're kind of looking at in your games?
Yeah, we're thinking about it, but we feel unsure about it because it's another sort of like pedagogical step you have to get through before you get to the point where you feel like you're really in the flow. And so our games are very light. None of our games have a weight of higher than like BGG 2.
Right. Wow. So yeah, really quite light.
Very, very light. And so like that it's more like cognitive load than it can't like justify its own cognitive load potentially. I don't know. Right? I just don't know. I have to, study it more. Also, talking. I think also, we get in the habit of talking about weight, but I think that might be like a mistake. I don't think weight is a thing. I think what is a thing is sort of the beat by beat experience that happens between opening the box and being fully into the game. And like every beat is its own thing and has to be considered as its own thing.
Oh, that's interesting. So you're looking at it much more from a kind of journey model rather than a sort of like this thing is like binary. Well, it's not binary, so it's not that it's binary, but it's just this idea that it just has some kind of ineffable complexity level that just is a certain hurdle to climb. When actually, one of the things, this is one of the fascinating things that I find is that I find actually what we think about how learnable something is so completely separate to weight in reality that weight number becomes meaningless. Because one of those things about Magnet is it's currently rated something like 3.2 on BGG. And now I think number one, part of the problem is that the BGG system, you can only vote it like in the actual voting, you can only vote medium heavy, or like you're not allowed as an individual user to give it a more nuanced number, for example, which is already not helpful for something that's not really a scale anyway. Is the scale it's already a poor model for the world, and then you have to put something super not unnuanced on that. Means that, for example, Magnet's got something like a 3.2, and yet actually that's like 0.1 or point away from brass, and it's just not that heavy. It's the problem is that in Magnet what we've noticed is it has a couple of like mechanics that are genuinely pretty unique to it, and that means that they are a bit of a hurdle to get your head around initially. What I noticed is this, right? There's like some really heavy Euro games that basically have sort of 30 different mechanics but they're all very familiar. And the way that they bisect is sometimes a bit odd, but it's broadly speaking, let's say it's a worker placement game, it's quite fundamentally modular on some design level, because you're like, well, I send a worker here and then a thing happens with a card that's just like every other thing with a card game I've played. Or I go over here and I get a point on a track, but it's like a track I've seen before. Whereas Magnet's more like there's like 2 or 3 chunky systems that are quite unusual.
So no one has seen them before, and they have to familiarize themselves with them.
Yeah, and then when they get over those humps, and actually the tutorial, one of the reasons I like the tutorial, and I still think it's more of a question of refinement rather than ditching it, is that it gets people over those humps pretty effectively from even if they're very casual gamers. It can take someone who has only ever played Monopoly, and they can play the game competently and be strategizing by the end. That's all that tutorial can do. But once you get over those you understand those three chunky pieces, you go, oh, okay, this is pretty straightforward. And I think that's partly the perception problem that amongst the heavier gamers that we've had a little bit, is that people go, oh, well, this is actually quite easy to do, because they're also looking back from, now I've grokked these three systems, I'm looking back at it and going, this fundamentally isn't super complicated, because they're only seeing three systems. They're not seeing like 50 different interlocking, but actually very familiar pieces. And I think that's another thing where it's like, well, what dimension is that? Like, that seems like a very different dimension, like how relatively complex individual, actually, that's about how relatively familiar individual mechanics are versus the amount of stuff you have to learn.
Right. It's not just also about familiarity. It's also about like the visuals on the table and how much the visuals allow you to sort of naturally infer what's going on.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. I talked to Phil Walker Harding once, who's one of my sort of game design idols, and he's also a model at Underdog for us. And so I'm in the habit of asking game designers, like, what are some heuristics, design heuristics that are really, really important to you, you know? And like the first one he said was like you should be able to set up the game on the table and have players who don't know the rules make good, educated guesses about how the game is played. So for this last game that we did, Her Story, I was one of the designers on it, and I thought about that. Like I tried to run with that idea so much for that game, and it was really fascinating. The game is definitely more intuitive than the other games that we've made in virtue of that constraint. May have overfit on that constraint, I don't know, but definitely has influenced me a lot.
Oh, absolutely fascinating. Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, isn't it? Like, it's something that I feel like I've heard before, and yet I feel like it's very easy to forget, because what it means is that there's an instant way in. People are looking at that and they're going, oh, I kind of get how this works. And as long as it doesn't then just completely subvert their expectations, and then gives them like, oh, I can see what the mental model is, and oh wait, no, this is something completely different. It doesn't do that. Then that's, again, if you see, you're less bothered by like thinking that there's some abstract weight, and you instead say, look, there's a learning journey here. That's like, well, actually, it's probably about step 3 of the journey. But actually, it's because probably step 1 started when you first saw the box cover.
Yep. Right. There's like, going back to the idea of beats, there's actually a ton of beats between opening the box and being fully into the game. And unless you decompose that experience into those beats, you're going to miss all kinds of critical things.
100%. 100%. Nick, this has been absolutely fascinating. And I actually feel like we could talk for literal hours and hours and hours more about this. I don't know about you, but
definitely.
So what I would love to do at some point is definitely do a part 2 and spend more time discuss these things, because there are loads of things we didn't get to, and some great listener questions this week about distribution versus direct, which we touched on, I think, a bit today, but I would love to spend more time talking to you about, and really, really good.
Yeah, we didn't. I know we sort of planned to talk a lot about that, and then we didn't.
Well, in the end, we didn't, and we talked about your entire product development model instead, which was absolutely at least as fascinating as that. And then also had some really great questions about Board Game Arena as well, which is like an entire sphere that I've not even had a chance to talk about. And so some brilliant ones. And I want to make sure at some point those listener questions get answered, because I think they're going to be really fascinating. So if you can certainly like to come back at that at some point, that'd be great.
I would love to. Yeah, this has been a great conversation. Your podcast is very savvy, and I just love it.
Oh, thank you so much. That is absolutely what I wanted to hear. That's excellent. Thank you so much. What things should we be looking out for from Underdog coming up soon? Obviously, we've talked quite a bit about Her Story. Does that hit the shelves quite soon? Or
yeah, actually, this is a make or break year for us. This is probably the highest stakes year we've had yet. So most of our sales so far have come from just 2 games, Trekking the National Parks and Trekking the World. And we've been in existence for 4 years, and those have been our pillars. So we have 2 more ambitious games coming out this year. First, Trekking Through History, which is a game where you sort of get into a time machine and visit like remarkable events from history.
Oh, fantastic.
And then the next one is Her Story, which is where you are an acclaimed author and you're writing a book about remarkable women of history.
So that's the framing you came up with in the end. That's really cool to hear that. Yeah. Amazing, fantastic. Well, I'm sure the listeners will be looking out for that one, for both of those. Actually, they both sound really, really interesting. And I think especially cool if they can actually have learned a little bit about how they came about as well, which is really fun.
I do want to emphasize, though, because I'm sure a lot of your listeners are heavy gamers. These are what you would call gateway games. They're very light. If you're a heavy gamer, you're probably not going to take these to your gamer group to play, with other heavy gamers. But if you have family or friends who aren't gamers or who are intimidated by what you like it's for that situation that we make these games.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, I'm sure. I think that sounds like very good advice, really, for that. Because as you said, I'm sure the audience does tend to skew quite heavy, but I no doubt they'll also just be interested in sort of unpacking how they work, I guess, and thinking more about your model.
Cool.
Wonderful. Well, Nick, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Producing Fun is produced by Naylor Games. If you enjoyed the show, follow us on Spotify, Stitcher, or other major podcasting platforms. Remember, Producing Fun is also a product, and it thrives on feedback. So please leave a review wherever possible, or simply send me your feedback directly. You can message me on Twitter @NaylorJames, or write me an email, james@naylorgames.com. Until next time.